The corridor was silent except for the sound of polished boots on marble. Thomas Hayes had stood guard at Windsor Castle for 12 years, but he had never been summoned at 3 in the morning, not like this, not with the kind of urgency that made his commanding officer's voice shake over the phone. "Report to the king's private study, immediately. Tell no one." Thomas's heart hammered as he walked through the dimmed hallways. The portraits of past monarchs seemed to watch him with knowing eyes. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He could feel it in the unusual silence, in the way the night staff avoided his gaze as he passed. When he reached the heavy oak door, his hand hesitated on the brass handle. Behind that door was King Charles. And from what Thomas could hear, he wasn't alone. He knocked twice. "Enter." The king's voice was weaker than Thomas had ever heard it. Inside, the room was lit by a single lamp. King Charles sat in a leather chair, his face pale and drawn. Standing beside him was Prince William, his expression grave. But what caught Thomas's attention was the object resting on the desk between them. The sword of state, it gleamed under the lamplight, ancient and magnificent. Thomas had seen it in ceremonies, watched it carried in processions, but never like this, ever in a private room in the middle of the night. "Close the door, Hayes," the king said softly. Thomas obeyed, his mouth dry. He was a witness to something. He knew it before anyone spoke another word. If you're finding this story gripping, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you'll want to see where this goes. King Charles looked at his son, then back at Thomas. "What you're about to witness must remain between these walls until the proper time. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty. Need you to understand the weight of that promise. Hayes." The king's eyes were tired, but sharp. "This isn't protocol. This is necessity." William stepped forward, his jaw tight. He looked older than his years in that moment. The weight of what was coming seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical thing. "My father is ill," William said quietly. "More than the public knows, more than we've told anyone." Thomas felt his stomach drop. King Charles raised a hand. "I'm not dying tomorrow, William. Let's not be dramatic." But there was something in his smile that didn't reach his eyes.
"However,
"I am no longer able to carry certain responsibilities. Not in the way they need to be carried." He placed his hand on the sword. "This sword represents the sovereign's command over the military, the authority to defend this nation, to make decisions in times of crisis." He paused. "I'm transferring that authority tonight." The room felt smaller suddenly. Thomas could hear his own breathing. William's face was stone, but his hands trembled slightly as his father continued. "You're here because we need a witness who isn't family, who isn't bound by emotion." King Charles looked directly at Thomas. "Someone who can testify that this was done with clear mind and full consent." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. King Charles stood slowly, gripping the edge of the desk. He lifted the sword with both hands, the metal catching the light, it seemed. Heavier than it should be, laden with centuries of power and duty. "William Arthur Philip Louis," the king said, his voice gaining strength. "I hereby transfer to you the authority of the sword. From this moment forward, you alone carry the sovereign's command." He held the sword out, and William, with tears glistening in his eyes, reached forward to take it. But before his fingers touched the hilt, the door burst open. Thomas's hand went instinctively to his sidearm. He spun toward the door, his training taking over. It was Princess Anne. She stood in the doorway, her face flushed, still wearing her riding clothes. She must have been called from the stables. Her eyes went immediately to the sword suspended between father and son. "So it's true," she said, her voice tight. "You're really doing this." "Anne." King Charles lowered the sword slightly. "This doesn't concern you?" "Doesn't concern me?" She stepped into the room, and Thomas could see the hurt in her eyes beneath the anger. "You're handing over sovereign command in the middle of the night like some kind of coup, and it doesn't concern me?" William finally moved. He stepped back from the sword, his hands falling to his sides. "This isn't what you think, isn't it?" Anne's voice cracked. "Father's ill, so you get the power early." "Is that not exactly what this is?" "That's enough," King Charles's voice carried. The full weight of his authority now, despite his weakened state, I won't have you speak to your brother that way. Anne's eyes glistened with tears. And what about me? What about the years I've served this family, this crown? I've never complained, never wavered. But when it comes to real power, to real responsibility, it's always the same. It goes to the air, always to the sun. The silence that followed was crushing. Thomas wanted to disappear into the walls. This was a family wound, deep and old, and he had no business being in the middle of it. But King Charles had called him here for a reason. To witness. To stand as proof that whatever happened in this room was legitimate. William spoke quietly. "Anne, you know why it has to be this way? The succession laws." "I know the laws," she snapped. "I've lived under them my entire life. But this," she gestured at the sword, "this is different. This is father choosing, and he's choosing you." King Charles sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. "Sit down, Anne, please." She didn't move. "I said sit." Slowly, reluctantly, she took a seat across from him. Thomas remained by the door, barely breathing. "You think I'm choosing William over you?" the king said. "But you're wrong. I'm choosing the crown over all of us. Over my own comfort, my own pride, my own time left on this earth." He picked up a document from the desk. His hand shook as he held it. "I received this 3 days ago. Intelligence reports. Credible threats against the realm that require immediate military response capabilities." He looked at "I can barely hold a pen anymore, darling. My doctors say I have 6 months, maybe a year, before the disease takes my clarity completely." Anne's face went white. "Father, the country can't wait for me to die," he continued. "And they can't know how weak I've become. Not yet. The stability of the realm depends on strength, on continuity." He turned to William. "He's ready. He's been preparing for this his entire life. So have I," Anne whispered. "I know. And you will carry more responsibility than ever, but the sword," looked at the ancient weapon. "The sword must go to the heir. That's not preference, Anne. That's survival. If I give it to anyone else, we open the door to constitutional crisis. 2 questions about succession. 2 chaos." Thomas watched Anne's face crumble. She wasn't crying, but the pain was written in every line of her expression. William moved toward her. "I need you," he said simply. "I can't do this without you. Father can't do this without you. You're the strongest person in this family. And why am I not strong enough for this?" Her voice was barely audible. "Because this isn't about strength." King Charles leaned forward. "It's about law, about order, about protecting something bigger than any of us." Anne closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The hurt was still there, but beneath it was resignation. Acceptance. "What do you need from me?" she asked. King Charles exhaled slowly. "I need you to witness this with Hayes. I need you to stand with your brother. And I need you to be ready." "Ready for what?" The king looked at his children, and Thomas saw something flash across his face. Fear for what comes next. King Charles stood once more, steadier this time, and lifted the sword. The metal seemed to hum in the quiet room, as if it understood the gravity of the moment. "William," he said, "step forward." William approached, and Thomas could see his hands were steadier now. Whatever doubt had been there was gone. This was a man accepting his fate. "Before these witnesses, I transferred the authority of the sword of state. You will carry the burden of sovereign. Command over His Majesty's armed forces. You will make decisions that save lives and take them. You will bear the weight of defense and war." King Charles's voice grew stronger with each word. "Do you accept this responsibility?" "I do," William said. The king placed the sword in his son's hands. For a moment, no one moved. The transfer was complete. In that private room, with only 3 witnesses, power had shifted in a way the world wouldn't understand for months, maybe years. Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He was watching history, the kind that gets written about centuries later. Anne stood slowly. She walked to her brother and placed her hand on his shoulder. "God help you," she whispered. Then she turned to Thomas. "You understand what you've seen here tonight must stay secret." "Yes, ma'am. Not secret forever, King Charles interjected. Just until the proper time. Until we've stabilized the transition. Until he stopped, grimacing. William moved quickly, helping his father back to the chair. You should rest. In a moment. The king waved him off. He looked at Thomas with intense focus. Hayes, I chose you for a reason. You're not aristocracy. You're not bound by centuries of tradition and expectation. You're a working man who serves with honor. If anyone ever questions the legitimacy of this transfer, you're my proof. You're my anchor to reality. Thomas felt the weight of those words settle on him like a crown of his own. I won't fail you, Your Majesty. King Charles smiled faintly. I know. A knock at the door made everyone freeze. Your Majesty? A voice called from outside. It was Edward, the king's private secretary. Sir, there's been an incident. The Prime Minister is on the line. He says it's urgent. William and his father exchanged a look. What kind of incident? The king called back. He wouldn't say, sir. Only that you need to be briefed immediately. He's asking for military consultation. The room went cold. William looked down at the sword in his hands. It was no longer ceremonial. It was real. And something was happening right now that required its authority. King Charles tried to stand, but stumbled. Anne caught him. Father, you can't. I have to, he said. But his body betrayed him. His legs wouldn't hold his weight. William's face went pale. I'm not ready. You have to be. King Charles gripped his son's arm. This is why we did this tonight. Why we couldn't wait. He turned toward the door. Hayes, open it. Let Edward in. Thomas moved to the door, his heart pounding. When he opened it, Edward stood there with a secure phone in his hand. His face was ashen. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister reports, a Russian submarine has been detected in British waters. They've lost contact with one of our naval vessels. He needs authorization to respond. The words hung in the air like smoke. William looked at his father. What do I do? King Charles's voice was barely a whisper now. You take the call. You listen to the military advisors, and you make the decision that protects this country. Oh. He paused. The sword is yours, William. That means the choices are yours too. Anne moved to her brother's side. We're with you. William closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had changed. The fear was still there, but beneath it was steel. The same steel that had carried his grandmother through a world war. The same steel that had built an empire. He took the phone from Edward. This is Prince William. Put the Prime Minister through. Thomas watched as the young prince listened, his face growing harder with each passing second. The sword rested against the desk beside him, its presence impossible to ignore. How many sailors? William asked. A pause. Are they still alive? Another pause. Longer this time. What are the military options? Thomas could hear the muffled voice of the Prime Minister through the phone, rapid and urgent. William's jaw tightened. No, William said firmly. We don't fire unless fired upon. I want every diplomatic channel opened. I want the Russian ambassador woken up and in Downing Street within the hour. And I want our submarines tracking theirs, but no aggressive action. Not yet. King Charles closed his eyes, a look of relief washing over his face. William continued, his voice steady. If our sailors are alive, we bring them home through negotiation. If they've been harmed, he paused, his hand unconsciously moving to the sword. Then we respond with the full force of the crown. Authority in his voice was undeniable. He was no longer just a prince. He was the sword. The next 6 hours blurred. Together like a nightmare. Thomas remained stationed outside the study while William coordinated, with military command, intelligence services, and the Prime Minister. Through the heavy door, he could hear the prince's voice, sometimes raised in disagreement, sometimes quiet with concentration. Anne had taken their father to his private chambers. The king was exhausted, barely able to walk. But he'd refused to leave the castle, insisting on being nearby in case William needed him. At dawn, Edward emerged from the study. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened. He looked at Thomas with hollow eyes. "The sailors are alive," he said quietly. "All 12 of them." Thomas felt his shoulders sag with relief. The Russian submarine had mechanical failure. They weren't hostile, just disabled and drifting into our waters. They didn't respond to hails because their communications were down. Edward rubbed his face. It was all a terrible misunderstanding. But if we'd fired first... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Thomas understood. William's first decision with the sword could have started a war. Instead, he'd chosen patience. Diplomacy. And he'd been right. "How was he?" Thomas asked. Edward looked back at the study door. "He's been on the phone with the Russian president for the last 20 minutes. They're arranging a joint rescue operation." He smiled faintly. "He's going to be a good King Hayes, maybe even a great one." But when William finally emerged, he didn't look victorious. He looked haunted. His eyes found Thomas immediately. "Walk with me." They moved through the castle in silence, William still carrying the sword. Guards stepped aside as they passed, their faces carefully neutral. They didn't know what had happened that night, but they could sense something had changed. William led them to the castle's private chapel. It was empty, lit only by candles and early morning light through stained glass windows. He sat in the front pew, setting the sword carefully beside him. "I almost killed people tonight," he said softly. 12 Russian sailors. Maybe more if it had escalated. I had my finger on that trigger, Hayes. I was seconds away from giving the order. Thomas sat beside him, unsure if he should speak. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the war," William continued. "About the choices she had to make. The people who died because of decisions made in rooms like the one we were in tonight." He looked at his hands. "I always thought I understood, but I didn't. Not really. Not until tonight." "You made the right choice," Thomas said quietly. "This time." William's voice was hollow. "But what about next time? What if next time hesitation is the wrong choice? What if people die because I waited too long?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. "Your Majesty, my father was in the military. He told me once that any soldier who doesn't fear killing is dangerous, but a leader who doesn't fear killing is catastrophic." He met William's eyes. "The fact that you're sitting here questioning yourself, terrified of the power you hold, that's what makes you worthy of it." William was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I need you to do something for me," he said. "Something beyond your duty as a guard. Anything, sir. Keep watching. Keep being that witness my father talked about." William's voice was intense now. "Not just tonight, but in the days to come. If I ever become the kind of leader who doesn't question, who doesn't fear the weight of this responsibility, I need someone to remind me. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth. You have your family for that. Family is complicated. You saw that with an..." William picked up the sword, feeling its weight. "I need someone outside the family. Someone who can see clearly." Thomas felt the magnitude of what was being asked. This wasn't just about being a witness to a ceremony. This was about being a conscience. A reminder of humanity in moments when power might make humanity seem irrelevant. "I'll do it," Thomas said. "On my honor." William extended his hand. They shook, and Thomas felt the firmness of the prince's grip. This was a man who had been tested and not found wanting. "Thank you," William said. They sat in silence for a while, the morning light growing stronger through the chapel windows. Outside, the world continued turning, unaware that in the darkness of the previous night, everything had changed. Finally, William stood. "I should check on my father." They walked back through the castle together. Staff were beginning their daily routines, the castle coming to life. Everything looked normal, but Thomas knew the truth. The man walking beside him wasn't just a prince anymore. He was the sword. And that sword could cut both ways. It could protect or destroy, save or condemn. When they reached the king's private chambers, Anne was waiting outside. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but she managed a small smile when she saw William. "Father wants to see you," she said. "He heard about the sailors, about your decision." William's face tightened with anxiety. "Is he angry?" "See for yourself." William entered alone, and Thomas took up position outside the door with Anne. They could hear voices inside. The king's weak but warm. William's uncertain and young again. Then they heard something that made Thomas's chest tighten. The king was crying. "I'm so proud of you," his voice carried through the door. So incredibly proud. Anne closed her eyes, and Thomas saw a tear roll down her cheek. Inside that room, a father was saying goodbye to his son in the only way that mattered, by watching him become the leader he was meant to be. And somewhere in the depths of the castle, locked away until the proper time, a press release sat waiting. A statement that would eventually tell the world that King Charles had transferred military authority to his heir due to declining health. But that announcement was still months away. For now, the secret remained with those who had witnessed it. Thomas Hayes, a royal guard who had simply been doing his job when history chose him. Anne, a princess who had set aside her hurt to support her brother. And William, a prince who now carried a burden that would define the rest of his life. The sword had been passed, and the world had no idea. 3 months passed. To the world, everything seemed normal. King Charles made his public appearances, though they became less frequent. The palace cited scheduling conflicts and minor health concerns. Nothing alarming. Nothing that would cause panic, but Thomas knew the truth. He'd been reassigned to William's personal security detail. On paper, it was a routine rotation. In reality, it was William keeping his promise, keeping his witness close. Thomas watched as the prince grew into his new role. William attended military briefings that should have gone to his father. He made decisions about troop deployments, naval movements, intelligence operations, all of it done quietly, with the king's official signature. But William's actual authority, the charade was necessary, constitutional, but it was also painful. Thomas saw it in William's face every time he visited his father. The king was declining faster than anyone had predicted. Some days he was sharp, engaged, almost his old self. Other days he barely recognized his own children. On one of those bad days, Thomas stood guard outside the king's sitting room while William sat with his father. Through the door, he could hear the king's confused voice. "Where's my mother? I need to speak with the Queen Mother." "She's gone, Papa. She passed away years ago." "No. She was just here. I saw her." A pause. "Who are you?" The silence that followed was devastating. When William emerged, his eyes were red. He walked past Thomas without a word, heading toward his own office. Thomas followed at a respectful distance. Inside the office, William poured himself a drink with shaking hands. He didn't usually drink during the day, but Thomas didn't comment. "He didn't know me," William said to the empty room. "My own father looked at me like a stranger." Thomas closed the door behind them. "I'm sorry, sir." William downed a drink in one swallow. "We're going to have to make the announcement soon. We can't keep this quiet much longer." He set the glass down hard. "The Prime Minister is pushing for it. Says the uncertainty is worse than the truth. What do you think?" "I think..." William's voice broke. "I think I'm not ready to tell the world my father is dying. I think I'm not ready to be king. I think I'm drowning, Hayes, and I don't know how to stop." It was the most honest thing he'd said in months. Thomas stepped forward. "Sir, you've been carrying this weight for 3 months. You've made dozens of critical decisions. You've prevented conflicts, managed crises, and kept this country safe. And you did it all while watching your father slip away." Paused. "If that's drowning, I'd hate to see what you consider swimming." William looked at him with something like desperation. "But what if I fail? What if the next crisis is bigger than I can handle?" "Then you'll handle it anyway." "Because you have to. Because the sword is yours, whether you feel ready or not." Before William could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and went pale. "It's an E," he answered, and Thomas watched his face crumble. "I'll be right there." He hung up and looked at Thomas. "Father's collapsed. They've called the doctors. Anne says." His voice caught. "She says we should come now." They ran through the castle corridors. Guards stepped aside, sensing the emergency. By the time they reached the king's chambers, A crowd had already gathered. Medical staff, family members, senior household officials. Queen Camilla stood outside the bedroom door, her face stoic, but her hands trembling. She looked at William and simply nodded toward the door inside. King Charles lay in his bed, pale and small against the white sheets. Anne sat beside him, holding his hand. The doctors worked quietly, their faces grim. William approached slowly, as if afraid his father might disappear if he moved too quickly. "Papa." King Charles's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they were cloudy, confused. Then something shifted. Clarity returned, sharp and painful. "William." His voice was barely a whisper. "My boy." William took his other hand, kneeling beside the bed. "I'm here," the king said. "You have it?" "Yes, I have it." "Good." Charles smiled faintly. "Did I ever tell you about the day my mother gave it to me?" "No, Papa." "I was terrified. Absolutely terrified. I thought I'd drop it during the ceremony. Thought everyone would see how weak I was." He coughed, and Anne reached for water, helping him sip. "But you know what she told me?" William shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "She said the sword doesn't make you strong. Being willing to carry it, even when you're afraid, that's what makes you strong." Charles squeezed his son's hand with what little strength he had left. "You're strong, William. Stronger than you know." "I don't feel strong." "Good, that means you're paying attention." The king's eyes drifted to Anne. "Take care of him. Both of you take care of each other," Llewellyn whispered. Charles looked around the room, his gaze finally landing on Thomas standing near the door. "Hayes, you're here." Thomas stepped forward. "Yes, Your Majesty. You've kept your word. You've been his witness." The king's breathing was labored now. "Keep watching. Keep reminding him who he is when the crown gets too heavy." "I will, sir. I promise." Charles nodded, satisfied. He closed his eyes, and for a moment Thomas thought he'd passed. But then he spoke again, so quietly they had to lean in to hear. "I'm ready now. I can rest." William pressed his father's hand to his forehead. "Thank you, Papa, for everything. For trusting me. For believing in me. I always believed in you. From the moment you were born." Charles's voice was fading. "My beautiful boy. My king." The last word hung in the air, and then the monitors began to alarm. Doctors moved in quickly. But Queen Camilla raised her hand. "No. Let him go peacefully." They stepped back, and the family surrounded the bed. William on one side, and on the other, Camilla at the foot. They held him as his breathing slowed, then stopped. King Charles III was gone. The room was silent except for the sound of crying. William bent over his father's body, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Anne wrapped her arms around him, her own tears falling onto her brother's back. Thomas stood by the door, witness to the end of one reign and the beginning of another. Outside, the world didn't know yet. The sun was still shining. People were going about their lives. But here in this room, everything had changed. The sword had passed from father to son in a secret ceremony 3 months ago, but the crown had just passed in the oldest, most painful way possible, through death, through loss, through love. The announcement came at sunset. His Majesty King Charles III has passed away peacefully at Windsor Castle, surrounded by his family. Within minutes, the world stopped. Flags lowered. News anchors spoke in hushed, reverent tones. People gathered outside Buckingham Palace, leaving flowers and crying for a king who had reigned for such a short time. But Thomas knew something they didn't. Charles's reign may have been brief, but his final act had been his greatest. He'd ensured a smooth transition in the most turbulent of times. He'd prepared his son not just for the crown, but for the terrible weight of real power. The sword had been passed when it needed to be, not when tradition dictated. Thomas stood in the background during the formal proceedings. He watched as William was officially proclaimed. King William V watched, as the young king, no longer a prince, took his oaths. With a steady voice despite the grief in his eyes, and he watched as the sword of state was carried in ceremony for the first time under the new reign. No one knew it had already been William's. For 3 months, no one except those who had been in that room at 3 in the morning after the public ceremonies. After the cameras and the dignitaries and the endless protocol, William requested a private moment in the chapel. Just him, Anne, and Thomas. They stood before the altar, the 3 of them who had shared that secret night. "We need to decide," William said quietly. "Do we ever tell the truth about that night? About the transfer?" Anne considered. "Father wanted it secret until the proper time." "Is this the proper time?" "I don't know." William looked at Thomas. "What do you think, Hayes?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "Your Majesty, I think some truths are meant to stay private. What happened that night wasn't scandal or deception. It was a father protecting his son and his country. It was love and duty intertwined." He paused. "The world doesn't need to know the exact moment the sword passed. They just need to know you're worthy of it." William nodded slowly. "Then it stays between us. Our secret, our burden, our privilege," Anne corrected gently. "We got to see him in his final act of service. Not many children can say they witnessed their parents' greatest moment of courage." William's eyes glistened. He was brave, wasn't he? Even at the end. The bravest, and agreed. They stood in silence, remembering. Then William turned to Thomas. "You're being promoted. Head of my personal security detail. I need you close, Hayes. I need that witness, that reminder you promised to be."
Thomas
felt the weight of the honor. "Sir, I'm just a guard." "No. You're the man my father trusted when it mattered most. You're the one who saw me at my weakest and didn't judge. You're the one who reminds me that the sword is a responsibility, not a right." William's voice was firm. "I need that, especially now." "Then I accept. It would be my honor." Anne smiled sadly. "Father would be pleased." They left the chapel together, stepping out into the evening air. The castle grounds were quiet, the chaos of the day finally settling. In the distance, Thomas could see the lights of Windsor town, where people mourned a king they'd loved. But here in the private spaces of the castle, 3 people carried a different kind of grief. The grief of knowing, of having witnessed something precious and terrible and transformative. Over the following months, Thomas watched William grow into his role. The young king, who had been terrified in that study, now commanded rooms with quiet authority. He made hard decisions with the weight of his father's wisdom behind him. But Thomas also saw the private moments. The times when William would touch the sword of state during ceremonies, and his eyes would grow distant. Remembering that night? Remembering his father's trembling hands passing it over? Remembering the moment he became more than a prince? 1 year after the secret handover, Thomas stood guard during a state dinner. William was addressing military commanders, discussing strategy and deployment with confidence. He was every inch a king. But when the dinner ended and the guests departed, William found Thomas in the corridor. "Walk with me," he said. It had become their ritual. These quiet walks where the king could stop being a king and just be a man processing impossible things. They ended up, as they often did, in the private study, where it had all begun. The room looked different. Now William had made it his own, but the memory hung thick in the air. "Sometimes I dream about that night," William said, sitting in the chair his father had occupied. "I dream that I reach for the sword and miss, that I drop it, that I fail." "But you didn't," Thomas reminded him. "You haven't, not once, not yet." William looked at his hands. "But the fear never goes away, does it? The fear that one day I'll make the wrong choice, that people will die because of me." "No, sir. I don't think that fear ever goes away, and I don't think it should." William looked up, surprised. "Your father gave you the sword because he knew you'd carry it with conscience. With doubt? With humanity." Thomas met his king's eyes. "The day that fear goes away is the day you become dangerous." William absorbed this, then nodded. "Thank you, Hayes, for being honest. For being here, always, Your Majesty." They sat in comfortable silence, king and guard, bound by a secret that would follow them to their graves. Outside, the world saw a young king who had ascended unexpectedly after his father's short reign. They saw ceremony and protocol and the smooth transition of power. They didn't see the reality. They didn't see a father who loved his son enough to break tradition, who gave him power when he needed it, not when it was convenient. They didn't see a young man who accepted a burden he didn't feel ready for because duty demanded it. They didn't see a princess who set aside her pain to support her brother. And they didn't see a guard who witnessed it all, who carried the truth like a sacred trust. But Thomas saw, and he remembered. He remembered the weight of the sword in dim lamplight, the tears in a father's eyes, the moment when a prince became something more. And as he stood guard outside that study, watching his king work late into the night, Thomas made a silent promise to the memory of King Charles III. He would keep watching, keep witnessing, keep reminding William of who he was in that moment of transfer. Man willing to carry impossible weight because someone he loved believed he could. The sword had been passed in secret, but its legacy would last generations. And Thomas Hayes, a simple guard who happened to be in the right place at the right time, would make sure of that. Because some secrets aren't meant to be kept forever. They're meant to be honored, protected, and remembered by those who understand their true worth. The world might never know what really happened that night at 3 in the morning. But Thomas knew. And that was enough.